Hi, everyone.
You?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Super. So I'm really pleased to be chairing this next session, which is titled The Opportunities and Challenges of Using EdTech Platform Data in Evaluation. And I'm joined by Timo and Dina from School Dash and Impact Ed, respectively, who will introduce themselves in a minute. And in terms of format for this session, I'm just going to give a quick overview of kind of why we ended up and how we ended up thinking about EdTech platform data so much recently, and why we're really keen to be here talking about it. And then Dina and Timo will each give a short presentation, and then there should be lots of time left for questions, discussions, etc. at the end. I guess just the first thing I wanted to say is I don't sort of self-identify as an evaluation researcher, and so I feel slightly nervous being here speaking to people who know so much. And my work actually involves, and this is useful context, I think, for why we're talking about what we're talking about. My work involves working with EdTech tools, digital learning tools, to try and help improve them, to help them meet the needs of teachers and children, and improve children's outcomes. And over the last year or so, that's involved a bit of collaboration with Timo and Dina and others, which is kind of why we've had so many conversations about this topic. And it's meant quite a lot of time spent looking at and trying to use, helpfully, data from EdTech platforms. So I guess worst case scenario for this session is that we can shout very loudly about EdTech platform data, because we hope it's a useful resource for all of you potentially in the future. And kind of best case scenario is we can do that, but we can also share some helpful ideas on how it will be useful for evaluation in the future, and some kind of practical lessons that we've learned over the last year from using EdTech platform data. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly to give a super bit of context. Hopefully you can see that, but stop me if you can't.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. So over the last year, we've been working to try and improve remote learning provision. And that's the main focus of that has been trying to work quite quickly. Actually, that's sort of one takeaway from the last year. Everything that we've been doing, it has felt like the clock has been ticking, which I think is relevant for us thinking about EdTech platform data. And a core bit of that work has been working with 6 EdTech platforms as part of a DFE funded program. And there's sort of 4 main things that we've been doing with those 6 EdTech platforms. So these EdTech platforms are digital learning tools. They might be curriculum resources, they may be parental engagement tools, etc. A bit of a variation. But we have been funding new features and improvements to implementation. Alongside that, we've been carrying out process evaluations. It's been Dina who's been leading that work with a group of some of their existing school users. And the idea of that has been to, in real time, try to inform the improvement of the design and the implementation of these tools. Thirdly, we've been analyzing usage data from across all users of the platform, so outside of the 67 schools. And finally, we've been running a set of professional development workshops for staff in participating schools. And we've seen these as a way to kind of feedback findings from these ongoing evaluations in as close to real time as we can, as schools were moving in and out of remote learning and were using these EdTech tools more than they had been in previous years. And so I guess why we're speaking today is that we found working with the EdTech platform data really informative. I think sort of three things that have stood out for us that will get explored a bit more in the presentations. One is the way that it's complemented, analysis of EdTech platform data has complemented other evaluation research on things like implementation, dosage, etc. The second thing is that it's really helped us to do things quickly. We've got sort of near real-time insights into how interventions are being delivered. And then the third theme that's really stood out is that we've really leaned quite heavily on some of the data that we've had access to be able to provide kind of actionable insights, both to schools using these tools, but also to the interventions themselves, the EdTech tools, to inform their work. So before we get into the two presentations, there's one other point that I want to make, which is just that for the purposes of this session, we're kind of talking about two separate categories of EdTech platform data. So the first category is data collected from platforms that are specifically designed to assist with evaluations. And Dina will be talking about the Impact Ed platform as one example of that. And then the second category of EdTech platform data, which we've been using over the last year or so, and we'll talk about, is data that is generated as a sort of byproduct of a digital intervention. So that's information about how often it's used. It might be the results of assessments which are taken through a digital learning platform, etc. So we've found it helpful to break up EdTech platform data into those two different categories. So that is a quick overview of sort of how we've ended up thinking about this topic over the last year. And I will now stop sharing and hand over to Dina to introduce herself and give a short presentation on her perspective on this topic. Dina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Toby. Hi, everyone. My name is Dina, and I work as the Impact Partnerships Manager at Impact Ed, and really excited to be here. And I guess a little bit more about myself in terms of where I'm coming at evaluation from. My background has mainly been in international development and education. I've spent the past 4.5, 5 years working in really volatile contexts and carrying out evaluation as a part of ongoing program delivery and development. And that really showed that there's a lack of language and a lot of more work that needs to happen in really embedding evaluation in an ongoing manner in contexts that are very volatile, but also in the formal education system, which then brought me to Impact Ed in the past year. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen and tell a little bit more about the Impact Ed platform that we've been using to collect evaluation data and how we've operationalized it during COVID and during what has been a very volatile time for schools and other actors collecting data in the past 1.5 years, and still continues to be that way. But before I get there, I also just want to share why we exist and why there is a need for an organization like Impact Ed. It became very clear early on. It became very clear early on as we came together, and we all have worked in the education sector for quite some years, that a young pupil during their course of going from primary to secondary school to university is exposed to a range of different interventions, starting from curriculum intervention within the school to out of school interventions. And during COVID-19, it became clearer that there are just more additional interventions that a young child is being exposed to. But as schools, as families, as the education sector, there was very little data around which of these interventions are having a positive impact, a negative impact, or even a negligible impact. And there also seemed to be a real evaluation deficit within schools and education actors to really then have this data at their disposal and make evidence-informed decisions. And that really was the impetus behind why Impact Ed was started and the work that we've been doing in the past 3.5, 4 years. And the way we do this work is through a three-pronged approach, and the very value of our work is to make sense, to collect, analyze, and make sense of data in a way that's understandable and accessible to the different partners that we work for, ultimately to improve the outcomes of young people that we want to help and we want to support. And that is done through 3 different ways. The first is a partnership model where we work with schools, organizations, charities, Department for Education, and at present we are also working with Nesta in partnership to understand what kind of evaluation support would be most helpful. We meet partners in schools where they are at instead of trying to impose an evaluation model or method that may not be appropriate or even ethical in most cases. And then also provide capacity building support that could be in the form of literature reviews, evidence gap maps, or anything from a theory of change workshop. But the component of our model that I'll be talking a bit further about today is our Impact Ed platform. We realize that data collection, as you're all aware, especially from schools, is really time-consuming process where teachers often face the brunt of this work in terms of uploading, updating sheets, and providing this data in a safe and secure manner, which is why we have developed a bespoke impact evaluation tool that supports teachers and gives them the autonomy to upload and share this data with us in a safe, secure, and an easy manner, but also gives them insights into how this data is being used and how it's being analyzed, so that data collection from schools does not become an extractive process where we are constantly asking for data without providing much visibility of what we are doing with that data. And I'll exactly show you what that looks like on our platform in a second. And then finally, we also do impact reporting and more end-to-end evaluations. This could range everything from a process evaluation, which we're doing with Nesta at the moment with the Nesta EdTech R&D program, to more quasi-experimental studies or RCTs as well, depending on the context and the need of the partner as well as the intervention. So yeah, in a nutshell, these are the different ways that we work with partners depending on where they're at in terms of the evaluation need. I'll spend a little bit more time talking about school data, because at the end of the day, our evaluations are as good as the data we're able to collect and in the time that we have to collect this data. And as an organization that does a lot of rapid evaluations, it's important to note that a rapid evaluation is not the same as a rushed evaluation, so that we're able to collect the right kinds of data in the right rhythm. So these are some screenshots from our Impact Ed platform, which I'll also be demoing in a bit. But the kinds of data we collect range from everything from demographic data, such as pupil premium eligibility, to whether the pupils are eligible for free school meals, EAL percentages, to more standard data, such as attainment data, which could be standardized assessments, such as SAT score, GCSE scores, but also teacher assessments, which have been really powerful in the past year, with a lot of examinations being not looking like they used to look. And we also collect predicted grades behavior data as well, which can inform a bigger picture or a wider picture of what the pupil is experiencing at school and outside of school. And then finally, we also collect skills data, which is linked to academically validated surveys that we have integrated with our platform. And we use academically validated surveys given the literature that backs it up, its reliability and validity. And they have also been proofed for the different age ranges that we have integrated them for. And this survey measures and the survey data is again integrated and linked to each individual pupil on the platform alongside their attainment data as well as more demographic data. And to the right-hand side of the screen, you're also seeing what a sample dashboard looks like. So now that we are collecting these different kinds of data, what does this dashboard look like for the teachers? So in a quick overview, the teacher can click on, for example, they want to understand how pupils are doing on self-efficacy in a particular term. They can click on that particular outcome and see the change experienced by the pupil, and then also break that down by, for example, pupil premium pupils versus others in the school. A more helpful way to perhaps show this would be to demo the platform itself. So I'll do a very quick demo. And again, at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to answer some questions about it as well, because I'm sure it will not cover everything. So this is just a quick snapshot of what the platform looks like for a teacher. So this is a test school that I've created for the purpose of this demonstration. So all the data and all the stuff that you see on the screen today are all dummy data that we have created. So there is no sensitive information here. So as a school that signs into the Impact Ed evaluation tool or platform, they'll be taken to their school homepage and they'll have a number of very simple dashboard of different options. As Impact Ed, we already create the evaluation and set it for the school, so they do not have to put in additional work, and they just click on the evaluation. And for instance, they want to measure the impact of Seneca in their school, which is an EdTech tool, for instance. They'll be taken to a page like this, and all the school or the teacher or the data manager would need to do is click simply on the pupils tab and add pupils to the evaluation. And this can be done by add pupils. And because our platform integrates with school MIS systems, which is again a big barrier to why data collection becomes so difficult, is that a lot of platforms struggle to integrate with school MIS systems, but once that is done and compliant with all the GDPR guidelines, we can have access to this entire school database. So as a teacher, they'll be able to see all the pupils in their year group or in their school, but as Impact Ed and anyone else, all this data will be anonymized and will not be visible to us. So for example, as a teacher, if you want to select the pupils taking part in a particular intervention, you can select them and just add them to the appropriate group, which in this case is the participating group. The platform also allows for the creation of a control group. So if there is an experimental or a quasi-experimental design underpinning the evaluation, this becomes possible here, where you select the second group and click them as the control group. The next step after adding the appropriate pupils is simply clicking on the evaluation measures tab and adding what we want to measure as part of this evaluation. And we often support schools and organizations to come up with an evaluation framework before we do go on this platform. So for instance, a school can choose to measure anxiety, levels of anxiety among pupils, citizenship skills, or it could be anything from curiosity to more subject-specific metrics. So for instance, I've already added one, which is the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale as an example. And you can also add attainment measures for the specific subject that you're interested in checking, what kind of format, which is whether that's a GCSE grade, a behavior rating grade, an engagement grade, and then you can set that up quite quickly, almost in less than 10 minutes, and then move on to the progress tab, which becomes again the most important tab in the evaluation, which the schools refer to run in surveys as well as keep track of how pupils are performing. So each school has a survey link that they can click on, which takes their pupils to this survey page. Pupils enter their first name and a code and then take the survey, and it's quite seamless and it's compatible with all devices. So people can take this at home on a cell phone if there aren't enough devices at home, which is something we learned with our research during the pandemic. And then once the pupil has completed the survey, the teacher can use this tab to refresh it in real time to see if the surveys have been completed, if people's data has been onboarded or not. So this is just the mechanics of what an evaluation looks like, and this can be tailored, and the teacher can choose how they want to tailor it to the needs of their pupils, which is one of the more unique factors. It gives teachers the autonomy to do this in a way that makes sense for them. The final thing I will show here before I take us back to the presentation is the reporting tab, which is, again, a feature that is really exciting for a lot of teachers because they want to be involved in the process of an evaluation and understand in real time how pupils are, for instance, doing on the anxiety survey. The way they can do that is by, so this is a dummy one, they can click on their particular intervention and they'll be shown what change looks like from baseline and final points of data collection and also overall change. And this can also be compared against different groups. As you can see, it could be again, all pupils compared to looked after children. It could be year group, gender. And as we've used different data categories, we see that the data is often, the overall numbers are often misleading, and there's a lot of data to unpack on these different subgroups. So, and they can also download the sheet and share it widely in the school as well, so that they are not confined to this platform. So that in a nutshell is our platform. I'll just quickly take us back to the slides. Here we go. So the last thing I wanted to share before I wrap up is how we've used this platform as an example of what this platform has been able to achieve in the past year. So we launched a lockdown lessons research project in the beginning of March, April 2020, right when the lockdown was at its peak. And it was a good testing ground for us to see how effective this platform can be when schools are closed and pupils are at home, and we know very little about how pupils are learning and coping with lockdown. So the main thing we wanted to understand was pupil levels of well-being and pupil learning during the lockdown, not only to inform our own understanding of what's happening and to make policy recommendations, but also to provide teachers in schools with this data so they know how pupils are faring at home and how they can intervene and provide the support that they need for their pupils. So in a snapshot, the study was, again, one of its kind to collect pupil level data from over 60,000 pupils in the country, and a number of over 90,000 assessments, but well-being assessments were conducted, and we also assessed for other interlinked learning measures such as metacognition, other custom learning assessments we designed, as well as anxiety assessments. And what has been really great is not that we've been able to collect this data and also share it with schools through the reporting platform that I shared with you earlier, but we were also able to gather a national benchmark. Now that we know how pupils in that period performed on average, it helps us also understand, and schools make sense of where pupils stand in their cohort, which has been very powerful for a lot of the schools. But we also understand that platform data isn't sufficient and isn't enough. So we've also complemented with more qualitative data. So we conducted a number of focus groups as well, because no platform can be a silver bullet to the wide range of data points that we need to collect to carry out this kind of evaluation. And here are just some key findings. I'll not go through all of them. The report is available on our website, but it was surprising to see that pupil well-being remained stable during the lockdown up until earlier this year, but it again conceals large differences in different subgroups, and we saw major differences between girls and boys in their levels of well-being, which has also been confirmed by other kinds of research that's coming out from the pandemic. And again, disadvantaged pupils were generally more affected in terms of their levels of learning and well-being. And exam year pupils, of course, had varying levels, higher levels of anxiety, and had more variable learning scores. And what was a more interesting insight that we gained from working with and talking to schools and teachers was that they were quite surprised that this is not the trend they anticipated initially when they went into lockdown, which again goes on to show that there is a lot of blind spots in how different sectors and stakeholders work together to conduct evaluations with schools and around schools. So with that, just to bring my part to a close, this has given us a lot to reflect on in the past year, as we've been able to use this platform to collect data and proxy data during a very unsettled and uncertain time, is for us to think about where we want to go and what we think the future of a tool like this is, and evaluation of this nature are. And what we are really trying to achieve is to empower schools and teachers to run context-sensitive evaluations and have the autonomy to do that. And evaluation not being an extractive process, but a collaborative process where teachers it's not a burden on already overworked teachers, but a way for them to understand their pupils and their needs better. And then in effect to allow the entire sector, but also schools and organizations and charities to make more evidence-based decisions to improve pupil outcomes. And finally, the part that we're finding very powerful is automating some of the data collection and analysis work that comes with this. And that being said, not all of this can be automated and should be automated, but there are some aspects of it that can be, that massively improves the collection of data, the validity of the data, and also avoids error, especially when we are able to collect large data from schools through their MIS. So I'll just stop there in terms of where we are headed next, and yeah, leave it there. Thank you so much for listening.
Super, thanks, Dina. I know there's been one question in the chat already, but we will hand over to Timo next, and then we'll kind of take all the questions together at the end. Timo, over to you to introduce yourself and share your screen. And I guess if Dina's been talking about that sort of first category of EdTech platform data kind of generated through platforms specifically designed for evaluation, Timo's been thinking more about that second category, the sort of byproduct platform data, which he's going to speak about now. Thanks, Timo.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Toby. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So yeah, I'm the founder of School Dash, and that's probably enough said about me. Actually, I'm going to explain a little bit in the first couple of slides what School Dash does, and then take you through some examples of what we've been working on and how we see it sort of panning out from here on. Let me just get control of my slides. So School Dash is a company, we're a small commercial company. We've existed for almost 6 years now. And our mission is to increase understanding of education through the use of data. That probably could be an accurate description of almost everyone here, but we particularly work with organizations, a wide range of organizations, so educational suppliers, publishers, EdTech companies indeed, charities, policy organizations, a few trusts and multi-academy trusts, media organizations. So basically people in and around the education system that want to understand it. And we try to be sort of highly analytical, and we try to use sort of compelling visualizations to help them understand the market they serve or the environment in which they work. And we're somewhat opportunistic about the data sources that we use. We obviously use a large amount of government data, particularly from the DfE, Ofsted, but also other contextual information from MHCLG and the ONS and other organizations as well, to help us understand how educational parameters are sort of affected or correlate with other societal or economic parameters. We also use other kinds of information sources and in a sense gather our own data. So we use school websites, for example. We gather information about teacher and technician vacancies. That's work we've done for a long period of time now, particularly in collaboration with the Gatsby Foundation and TeacherTapp, understanding the teacher sort of recruitment market, if you like. And we even use social media data to understand things like, what are people talking about with respect to schools and sort of what do they think about it in terms of positive or negative sentiment. But increasingly over the last few years, but actually in particular the last few months, we've been making use of data from our clients and collaborators. So through Nesta, we've worked with a range of EdTech companies to look at their data, and I'll show you some examples of the sorts of things that we've been doing and the sorts of conclusions we've drawn from that. We've also worked very closely with people like Hodder, who have a business called RS Assessment, a primary attainment assessment test business, if you like. I'll show you briefly some examples of what we've been doing there. Educate, which is a pupil wellbeing survey company. We've recently completed a study with Oak National Academy, and we're working with other groups such as the EdTech Evidence Group, EEG, which is a group of EdTech companies that are interested in evidence-based decision making, and we're working with them to explore options with their constituents. Given that, I just wanted to say the way I kind of see it, and I'm really interested in sort of feedback either at this event or beyond, is this is sort of, I think of this as observational data that sort of complements the experimental data. So experimental data, I mean, there's a sort of certain control, perhaps contrived situation, which you're able to gather lots and lots of information in a controlled environment. What we're dealing with mainly is sort of observational data, as Toby was saying, that's sort of gathered anyway in the course of other activities, but what sort of insights can we glean from that? And there's a sort of a long, and I would argue noble history of making use of that kind of information. My own academic background is in biology, specifically in neuroscience, and there, everyone from Darwin onwards has dealt a lot with sort of observational data, and very important insights came out of that observational data, not necessarily from experimental data. In physics, you can look at the detection of gravitational waves, for example, which had to wait for two black holes to collide rather than conducting an experiment in a laboratory. But we also see that in the social sciences and in policy, particularly during the course of the pandemic, but obviously it predates that. So famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, Andy Holday, the chief economist at the Bank of England, was using sort of unconventional sort of real-time or near real-time data to make calls on his expectation in terms of the shape of the recovery. But also, perhaps in a slightly more sober way, Ian Diamond, the UK national statistician, issued a very interesting blog post around what effects the pandemic has had on the way he and his colleagues think about data. And that included things like using, as it were, unconventional data sources to understand things, perhaps in a slightly messier way, but in a real-time way, and adding insights to the more traditional, more controlled sources of information. So with that, I'm going to give you 4 quick examples of the kinds of work we've done. I'm going to skip through it very quickly. So if you've got questions about it, I'm happy obviously to answer them afterwards, or you can follow up with me if you want to know more. In each of these, down at the bottom left, there's a URL. So if you wanted to find out more or go to the actual write-up, please do that. Most of these figures I'm going to show you are sort of interactive, so you can explore them a bit yourselves if you want to. So one piece of work that we did with Nesta, which covered data during the first part of the pandemic, during the sort of spring and summer last year, we looked at half a dozen or so EdTech platforms, specifically in maths actually, and we looked at everything from just overall increases or changes in activity, which varied according to what kind of a product it was, how well established, whether it was targeted at schools or parents and so forth. But we were also able to look at things like, what seemed to be the trends with respect to deprivation levels, for example. So these charts here give you some idea of what kinds of activity we saw pre and post lockdown in low deprivation schools, so schools with a low proportion of free school meal kids or pupil premium kids, medium and high. And to cut to the chase, basically what we saw is that during the course of lockdown, what happened was the high deprivation schools that had been making relatively low use of these products pre-lockdown and pre the pandemic actually caught up in a sense. That's what this chart here shows. And they started making more use of it. But that was at the school and teacher level. When we looked at the pupil engagement level, the pupil activity level, they hadn't caught up. So what it was telling us was that schools were adopting these platforms. Schools that hadn't previously adopted these platforms were doing so, probably of necessity because of distance learning, but the pupils were not as engaged as in other types of schools, which is obviously a source of concern. This is more recent work that we've done with Nesta. This is one particular product where again, we're looking, in this particular case, we're looking at the effects of deprivation. This runs from early 2020, so pre the first lockdown, up to the latest date here is sort of March this year. And what we see is a trend whereby this is a graph showing high deprivation schools, so schools with high proportions of free school meal kids, which are relatively less active when you control for the pupil population, relatively less active during the early part of the lockdown, but they catch up. And in fact, during the early part of this year, were more active than the average school when you allow for their pupil population. So they're now making greater use of these platforms. This chart shows the device type. So we're able to look at, are the kids who are accessing them using phones or using tablets or using computers or what? And what we see again by deprivation level is that particularly during the early and mid part of the pandemic, there was a substantial gap and there were fewer pupils using computers at the high deprivation schools. But that gap, at least for this product, seems to have closed over time. And by the early part of this year, had not quite disappeared, but largely disappeared in terms of the device usage. This graph looks at the sort of relative pupil engagement. So how engaged were the pupils, baselining it on teacher activity. So basically we can use a comparison of the level of teacher activity in a school with pupil activity to sort of get a rough metric of pupil engagement. And there, unfortunately, we see there is a gap by deprivation level, and that is more or less sustained throughout the whole period and still seems to be in existence today. So that's a sort of a bit of a whirlwind tour. There's lots more that we did, but that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of what we covered with Nesta. We've also done a lot of work, as I mentioned, with RS assessment, part of HODA. That predates the pandemic, but during the pandemic, we've been putting out reports and analyses every term, looking at comparisons, comparisons of the current cohort with previous cohorts to see what are the year-on-year changes that might be attributed to the pandemic and the school closures. And we see, without going into the detail here, we see substantial changes compared to the year-on-year fluctuations pre-pandemic were extremely small. We're talking about thousands of schools, tens or hundreds of thousands of pupils. And we see substantial declines, so particularly larger among younger pupils, among poorer pupils in schools, and usually in sort of more technical subjects, as it were. So more in maths than in reading, for example, more in grammar than in spelling, those kinds of things. And we can also look at the distributions of the shifts. So we can, generally speaking, we see like all levels of ability shifting in a similar way. So this cumulative graph here, which sort of, in most cases, would shift to the left, and you just see all ability levels similarly affected. In this particular case, which is year one reading, we actually see lower and medium abilities more affected, and a smaller group of high ability kids at the top here, relatively less affected.
Timo, I'm so sorry to interrupt. could I force you to try and finish in 1 or 2 minutes? I just want to make sure we've got time for questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. We also did some work with EduKit on pupil wellbeing, but I'll skip over that and just jump to the last couple of slides. Pros and cons. This kind of data is very plentiful. It places no burden on schools at all, and it's very timely, more or less real-time information, at least in principle. But of course, it's diverse and inconsistent. The samples are self-selected, we don't control them, and we can't control the conditions under which the data are gathered. So we see them as sort of complementary to the traditional evaluation approaches, certainly not anything trying to replace them, but we think that they can be useful alongside them, and perhaps we can discuss that in the discussion period. We're also working now on, under discussion with our various collaborators, is the idea of how can we do this on an ongoing basis. And so we're exploring the idea of a data trust and a data hub that can do not just ad hoc analyses, but could actually do this on an ongoing basis. It seems to me this kind of analysis shouldn't just be something we do during the pandemic, but it should be part of the new normal. And there's more information available on my contact details. But with that, I'll stop and hand back to Toby so we can have a discussion.